Most people think states collapse when they become weak. History suggests the opposite. States usually fail when they are still powerful, still wealthy, and still convinced they've figured things out. The army still exists. The bureaucracy still functions. Taxes are still collected. The flag still flies. On the surface, nothing looks broken. But beneath that surface, something far more important has already started to fail. Not money, not technology, not even leadership, coordination. This is the problem Ibn Khaldun was trying to understand more than 600 years ago. And it's why calling him the first economist actually misses the point. Ibn Khaldun wasn't interested in prices, trade balances, or abstract growth. He was trying to answer a much more dangerous question. Why do states stop working long before they collapse? That question matters more today than ever, because modern systems don't fail loudly. They fail quietly, while still expanding, still spending, and still projecting confidence. And by the time collapse becomes visible, the real failure is already irreversible. Ibn Khaldun saw this pattern centuries before charts, GDP, or macroeconomic models existed, not because he was guessing, but because he had a front-row seat to state failure in real time. Ibn Khaldun was born in 1332 in North Africa into a world defined by instability. Dynasties rose and fell quickly. Rulers changed often. Cities flourished and emptied within a generation. Plagues erased populations. Alliances shifted constantly. This was not an environment for abstract theorizing. It was an environment where power malfunctioned in plain sight. Ibn Khaldun wasn't an academic sealed off from reality. He worked inside governments. He served rulers. He advised courts. He watched states make decisions, enforce policies, extract wealth, and then lose control of the very systems they depended on. What struck him wasn't that rulers were evil or stupid. It was that the same failures repeated across cultures, religions, and regions, even when intentions were reasonable. Different flags, different beliefs, same breakdown. That repetition is what led Ibn Khaldun to his central insight. States are not machines. They are social organisms. And like all organisms, they don't die suddenly. They weaken internally long before collapse becomes visible. Modern audiences often approach Ibn Khaldun looking for economic wisdom, and they find it. Taxation, incentives, productivity, diminishing returns. Those ideas are real and important. But for Ibn Khaldun, economics was never the core subject. It was a diagnostic tool. He wasn't asking, how do economies grow? He was asking, why do governing systems lose their ability to mobilize people? That distinction matters, because a state can appear economically large while being organizationally fragile. It can collect vast revenue while losing legitimacy. It can enforce compliance while destroying participation. And once participation collapses, no amount of force can substitute for it indefinitely. This is where Ibn Khaldun's most famous concept is often misunderstood. The word Ibn Khaldun used was asabiya. It's usually translated as social cohesion or group solidarity, but that translation is incomplete. Asabiya is not about shared identity alone. It's not tribalism, culture, or emotion. It's the capacity of a group to act together. In modern terms, asabiya is coordination efficiency. It determines whether people trust institutions, whether rules feel legitimate, whether effort feels rewarded, whether individuals believe participation is worth it. High asabiya means low friction. People cooperate without constant enforcement. Institutions function with minimal coercion. Productivity flows naturally. Because incentives align. Low asabiya means the opposite. Rules require force. Compliance becomes expensive. Trust erodes. Every transaction becomes defensive. Ibn Khaldun observed that early-stage states almost always have high asabiya, not because they are morally superior, but because survival demands it. Young states are usually disciplined, adaptive, and efficient. Roles are earned, not inherited. Leadership is close to the productive base. Waste is limited because resources are scarce. Most importantly, the ruling structure depends directly on the participation of its people. When incentives align, productivity follows. People work because effort leads to reward. They comply because rules feel fair. They defend institutions because those institutions still serve them. This is the phase historians romanticize. But Ibn Khaldun didn't. He saw it as temporary, not ideal, because success changes behavior. And this is where failure begins, not with corruption or decadence, but with distance. As a state succeeds, its leadership becomes insulated from the processes that created that success. Bureaucracies expand. Administrative layers multiply. Decision-making becomes abstract. The state no longer feels dependent on individual effort. It feels entitled to output. This is a critical psychological shift. When rulers and institutions stop seeing productivity as something that must be nurtured and start seeing it as something that can be extracted, the relationship changes. Incentives invert. Participation becomes obligation. Contribution becomes expectation. Compliance becomes enforced. At this stage, nothing looks broken. In fact, this is often when states feel most confident. Revenue is high. Institutions are complex. Authority is consolidated, but coordination is already weakening. Ibn Khaldun was very clear on this point. Decline is not caused by laziness, immorality, or decadence in the moral sense. It's caused by predictable incentive shifts. When survival pressure disappears, behavior adapts, risk-taking declines, innovation slows, protection of status replaces creation of value. Extraction becomes easier than production, especially for those close to power. The state begins to live off past momentum rather than present productivity. This is not corruption in the criminal sense. It's normalization. Everyone adjusts to a higher baseline of comfort and complexity. Costs rise quietly. Expectations harden. The system becomes heavier, not weaker yet, but slower and less responsive. And this sets the stage for the most misunderstood part of Ibn Khaldun's work. Most people associate Ibn Khaldun with taxation. Low taxes early, high taxes late, declining revenue. That observation is accurate, but it's secondary. Taxes rise because coordination fails. As asabiya weakens, voluntary participation declines. Productivity slows. Compliance becomes fragile. To maintain output, the state increases extraction. At first it works. Revenue continues to rise, not because the system is healthy, but because momentum hasn't run out yet. This creates the illusion that higher extraction is sustainable. But it isn't, because the problem is no longer economic. It's organizational. The state now needs more enforcement to get less cooperation. Administrative costs rise. Bureaucracies expand further. Each fix introduces new inefficiencies. This is the beginning of the failure loop, and it happens long before collapse. This is the phase Ibn Khaldun found most dangerous. From the inside, the system feels managed. Policies exist for every problem. Institutions appear sophisticated. Authority is centralized. From the outside, it looks stable, but internally, Coordination costs are exploding. Trust is thinner. Compliance requires pressure. Participation becomes transactional. People engage not because they believe, but because they must. And that difference changes everything. Because productivity cannot be coerced indefinitely. Force can compel obedience. It cannot compel creativity, risk-taking, or innovation. Once that line is crossed, the state is no longer growing. It's maintaining appearances. And that is where Part 1 ends. Because if this is how state failure begins, quietly, structurally, and invisibly, the real question becomes, what happens next when extraction replaces participation and enforcement replaces trust? Because after a certain point, decline is no longer a choice. It becomes a structural trap. Ibn Khaldun understood this with unsettling clarity. States don't fall because they make one catastrophic mistake. They fall because every response to weakening coordination makes the next problem harder to solve. This is the failure loop. As coordination weakens, the state faces a dilemma. Productivity slows, participation declines, revenue becomes harder to sustain, but institutional commitments don't shrink. Courts still exist. Armies still need funding. So the state compensates. It increases taxation. It tightens regulation. It expands enforcement. At first, this feels reasonable. After all, authority still exists. Laws are still obeyed. Compliance can still be compelled. But Ibn Khaldun recognized the hidden cost. Enforcement is expensive. When people comply voluntarily, the system runs cheaply. The state begins spending more just to maintain the same level of order, and that changes the nature of power. Ibn Khaldun made a distinction that modern systems often forget. Legitimacy is cheaper than force. When people believe a system is fair, they enforce it themselves. Norms do the work that armies otherwise must. When belief erodes, the state has only one option left: coercion. But coercion does not scale well. It creates resistance. It encourages evasion. It shifts energy away from production and toward avoidance. The state becomes trapped, spending more resources to extract fewer real contributions. And yet, from the outside, power still looks intact. This is why late-stage systems often appear strongest just before they fail. One of Ibn Khaldun's most overlooked insights concerns bureaucracy. As coordination weakens, states don't simplify, they complicate. Rules multiply to manage exceptions. Offices expand to enforce compliance. None of this begins as corruption. It begins as administration. But bureaucracy has a compounding effect. It consumes output without generating it. Each additional layer increases friction. Each new rule requires interpretation. Each enforcement mechanism demands oversight. Eventually, the system exists primarily to sustain itself. At that point, the state is no longer an organizer of productivity. It is a claimant on it. And claimants multiply faster than producers. Here is one of Ibn Khaldun's most counterintuitive observations. Systems feel most confident when they are closest to failure. Why? Because complexity creates the illusion of control. When institutions are simple, fragility is visible. When institutions are vast, fragility is hidden behind procedures, credentials, and process. Late-stage states are rich in rules, rich in offices, rich in authority. They can still mobilize resources temporarily. They can still suppress dissent briefly. This leads leaders to mistake capacity for health. But capacity without coordination is brittle. And once the system relies primarily on force and extraction, It enters the most dangerous phase of all. Modern states have one tool Ibn Khaldun didn't see directly, but he would recognize instantly: debt. Debt allows states to preserve scale without immediate productivity. It functions like delayed taxation, extracting future output to support present structures. For a time, it works. Confidence holds. Growth appears stable. The illusion of sustainability strengthens, but debt doesn't fix coordination. It masks its failure. The system continues consuming future effort while weakening present participation. When growth slows, obligations remain. When trust weakens, borrowing becomes harder. The arithmetic eventually asserts itself, not as a sudden collapse, but as narrowing options. Ibn Khaldun would recognize this moment immediately. It's the phase where maintaining stability becomes more important than restoring health, where appearances are managed aggressively, where confidence is defended rather than earned. Leaders reassure, institutions signal strength. Complexity increases further, but underneath, cooperation continues to erode. This is not collapse. This is pre-collapse. The stage where systems are most vulnerable because they are least honest with themselves, and it persists until something breaks the illusion. Ibn Khaldun understood that markets respond faster than governments. Prices move before policies change. Confidence shifts before statistics register it. Risk appetite declines before crises are acknowledged. In late-stage systems, financial markets often detach from real productivity. Asset prices rise faster than wages. Speculation outpaces creation. This creates the appearance of wealth without the cohesion to sustain it. When corrections arrive, they don't just reset valuations. They test belief. Who trusts the system? Who expects protection? Who absorbs the loss? These moments reveal how much asabiya remains. One of Ibn Khaldun's most important insights is this: collapse is not primarily economic. Resources don't disappear. Skills don't vanish. Technology doesn't regress overnight. What disappears is cooperation. People disengage. Risk-taking stops. Innovation slows. Participation becomes minimal and defensive. The economy contracts not because inputs are gone, but because trust is. And that is why collapse feels sudden, even though it was years in the making. Ibn Khaldun observed that decline always creates space for renewal. As old elites lose legitimacy, new groups with stronger cohesion emerge. They are disciplined because they must be, adaptive because survival demands it. The cycle resets, not because history seeks balance, but because incentives realign. Importantly, Ibn Khaldun never promised escape. He didn't believe wisdom could freeze systems in their prime. His conclusion was more unsettling than that. Decline is not a failure of intelligence. It is a consequence of success. The same forces that build effective states, coordination, discipline, shared purpose, are slowly eroded by the comfort and complexity that success creates. Understanding this doesn't grant immunity. It grants clarity. And clarity changes how you interpret the world. Ibn Khaldun wasn't writing personal finance advice, but his framework offers something just as valuable: perspective. You stop mistaking scale for stability. You stop confusing growth with health. You recognize when incentives are shifting, even if headlines haven't yet followed. You understand that trust, not returns, is the most fragile variable in any system. This is where real financial awareness begins, not with prediction, not with timing, but with humility. Ibn Khaldun didn't study economics to optimize prosperity. He studied state failure to understand its inevitability. By anchoring power and wealth in human behavior, he stripped collapse of its mystery. Cycles stop being shocking when you can see their mechanics. History doesn't repeat because people are foolish. It repeats because incentives remain stubbornly consistent. Beneath every empire, every market, and every institution lies the same fragile foundation: coordination, legitimacy, trust. When they hold, systems function. When they fracture, decline begins quietly, long before collapse announces itself. And that is the lesson Ibn Khaldun left us. If this gave you a new lens on history, subscribe, not to predict the future, but to stop being surprised by it.